Everybody, thanks for coming.
Morning.
That's good to know. Good morning. So I'm sure most of us have done leases before, but I just wanted to go over the contract again. The contract was updated just recently, June of 2023. So there are some changes, including attachments that hadn't been a part of the lease package. But let's just go through the lease agreement to begin with. And by the way, you probably noticed in using zip forms that you have options in terms of using the former or the editor classic or open in new form editors, something that has been mentioned in the past. Eventually, the form editor classic is going to go away. And if you're new, then you won't even have the option of using the form editor classic. So I'm going to use the new version. I actually like it. So I've got the lease agreement in front of us. I'm going to go over what I consider to be the highlights of the lease agreement. If we look at the very beginning, as a matter of fact, it talks about the rental property owner, landlord is no longer used, and the rental property owner or the authorized broker or agent or property manager can all act as the rental property owner. So remember, if it's a broker that's signing on behalf of the landlord or rental property owner, they must have written authorization. And if it's a property manager, they should have written authorization to sign the lease agreement on behalf of the rental property owner. And then section 1B, we would list here all the names of the occupants that are going to be residing within the property. So it's very important that you list everybody's name, and there's various reasons. So for example, what if 4 people are occupying a property and suddenly there's a 5th person appearing there? Well, that's a lease violation. And you can actually modify the lease agreement if you wish. However, keep in mind, if you're subject to the Tenant Protection Act, you cannot charge any additional money. You can only invoke 2 additional rate increases within a 12-month time frame if you're subject to the Tenant Protection Act. But you're still falling within the constraints of the maximum rate increase during 12 months, or based upon the last high or the lowest base rent during the preceding 12 months. And by the way, if you're subject to the Tenant Protection Act now, effective August 1st, the maximum rent increase is 8.8%. We sent out notification yesterday. So keep that in mind. And then under terms, section 2, it talks about the commencement date, and it also references if tenant is not paid all amounts then due, tenant has no right to possession or keys. And when it's talking about all amounts then due, it's actually talking about section 5. And in section 5, we're going to define when payment must be made, the due dates, security deposit, rent, so on and so forth. So what takes place if a tenant does not make the payments when due? Well, the landlord has the option of giving a notice to perform, in a sense, and saying you must make those payments within 2 days. And if the tenant does not do that, the landlord has the option of voiding the lease. But they must return all monies that they may have collected. And I would say that that is a preferred method as opposed to trying to enforce the lease. So the options are, you can void the lease after giving the appropriate notice, or the landlord can enforce the lease. I won't get into enforcing the lease. It's taking, I'm seeing usually 4 to 6 months in a traditional eviction to get rid of people. And you may not be able to lease the property up. So very important, as a matter of fact. And then section 2B, it's talking about the termination of the lease agreement. And if you look down to section I, housing provider and tenant have extended this agreement in writing or sign a new agreement, or it can be mandated by any rent increase cap or just cause eviction control under any state or local law. Why I want to bring this up, if the landlord is subject to the Tenant Protection Act, if the tenant has not violated the lease agreement, the landlord may not be able to terminate the lease agreement. There's only 15 reasons why a landlord can terminate the lease agreement if they are not exempt from the Tenant Protection Act. If you're exempt and you've provided notice of the exemption, you don't have to have a reason to not once again lease the property to the existing tenant. But if you're subject to the Tenant Protection Act, you may not be able to terminate that lease. You may have to offer them terms similar in nature. So reasons why you could theoretically void it would be non-payment. So that would be a reason for non-renewal. If you're going to occupy the property yourself, or maybe a family member, that is a reason that even if you're subject to the Tenant Protection Act, you may not have to renew the lease agreement, or if you're going to substantially remodel the property, another reason. However, if you don't meet those reasons, you may have an obligation to continue renting that property to the existing tenant, even though you may not want to. Any questions about that? Because those are really important aspects of the lease agreement. And who's subject to the Tenant Protection Act? Well, there are people that could be exempt. Remember, you have to provide notice of the exemption using, for example, the rent cap and just cause notification form. So those that have the ability to be exempt would be individuals that own the property. It could be a family trust, but if it's an S corp that owns it, or a corporation that owns the property, they may not be entitled to the exemption. If it's an LLC that has a corporate member, you may not be entitled to the exemption. Or if the property is 15 years of age or newer, then the exemption is available to you. And then also keep in mind, typically, if it's 2 units or more, usually the exemption is not available. If it's a duplex and the owner moves into the property prior to the other unit being occupied, the exemption is available. But if that's not the case, the exemption is not available. If it's a 3-unit, a 4-unit building, the exemption is not available unless it's 15 years of age or newer.
Is that applicable to LA County and Orange County? Or?
It does, as a matter of fact. That's the entire state of California, and LA County is a good example, because if their restrictions are even greater than the Tenant Protection Act, then that's going to supersede the Tenant Protection Act. Good question. And then section 3C or 3, let's talk about when rent is due. It's pretty simple. Tenant agrees to pay so much rent, so maybe it's $3,000 a month. All right, very simple, right? And then you can specify how the rent is to be paid. And keep in mind that the default aspect is that payment by Venmo and things like that is not permitted unless you check the box stating that it is acceptable to the landlord. And then the way the lease is going to be put together. So if the tenant's going to occupy the property mid-month, well, you have options. You can state that the first month is due in advance, and the lease states thereafter for the next month, the balance is based upon a pro rata portion for that month. So it's based upon a 30-day proration. So if I have the first month and the first month ends on the 15th, and September, for example, is 30 days, I would be paying 15/30 of the rent due by the 15th of September, for example. Or you can even structure the rent such that if it starts September 15th, you can have the tenant just pay for those 15 days if you wish. But remember, you cannot collect more than 1 month's advance rent. You can collect 6 months or more, but you can't collect 2, 3, 4, or 5 months advance rent. It's a dumb law. It is a dumb law, but unfortunately,
But it's okay for 6.
it is 6 is okay, assuming the lease is for a period of 6 months or greater, right? So advance rent, 1 month. And the other thing that's going to be happening, you can't collect the last month's rent. So now the MLS is going to be the MLS actually, when you're putting in a lease agreement, has the ability to specify payment of the last month's rent. That's going to be removed from the MLS because it would be a violation, and that is not applicable to commercial property. Commercial property is not regulated by the Tenant Protection Act.
Never noticed that.
There you go. Learned something new today, huh? At least one thing. And then security deposit. Oh, we do?
Mine.
Just curious, if they wanted to, though, is there a form that can be filled, or just a statement, waiving the right to
it's voided against public policy, and you would tell them, even if they elect to not comply with the existing law, it's not enforceable. And then if I'm the housing provider, I'm not going to put myself in the position of violating the law. Because if that tenant is unhappy for some reason, guess what they're going to do? They're going to contact an attorney or they're going to contact the housing authority, and they're going to just blame the landlord.
Yeah.
So what I would do, if they want to do that, Maya, I would say, you're violating the law, and I advise you against doing that. You should speak to legal counsel. So that would be my approach to something like that.
In writing.
In writing, and I haven't found anybody that's typically willing to violate the law when you tell them that. Most people aren't even aware of it, which is very surprising to me.
You know, sometimes the landlords get upset when you tell them that.
They do get upset, but it's really for their benefit. That's what you're required to do, right? Otherwise, they're going to blame us if we don't tell them also. That's the other aspect. Did that answer your question, Maya?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, great. And then the security deposit, section 4, obviously, we don't want to be holding security deposit. We want the landlord to maintain that. The landlord has no obligation to hold those funds in a trust account. We do if we were to hold those monies, and we're obligated to hold that in a trust account. And then the security deposit can be used for a number of things. So this paragraph specifies that. So if the tenant damages a property and the landlord has to repair it, and they can deduct money from the security deposit during the term of the lease, and they can make a demand, and within 5 days, the tenant has an obligation to replenish the used security deposit. If they don't, the landlord theoretically could issue a notice to perform or a demand to replenish that. And if not, they can terminate the lease agreement. And then another thing that is a dramatic issue is returning the unused security deposit at termination of the lease. So the landlord has an obligation within 21 days following the time that the tenant vacates the property. Big difference, not lease termination, but vacates the property, to provide an accounting of any monies withheld from the security deposit and remit the balance of the security deposit, if any. So often you may not know what those deductions are going to be. You can estimate them. You can also estimate vacancy in regards to deducting costs from that security deposit. But it's critical that you do comply with that 21-day time frame. Otherwise, the tenant could be entitled to sue you and obtain as a penalty 2 months security deposit plus recovering the security deposit itself. So theoretically, up to 3 months of the security deposit. So let's not put ourselves in that position. And then if the expenses that the landlord is deducting is less than $125, no documentation is needed. If the expenses that are being deducted are in excess of $125, the landlord has an obligation to provide documentation of the expenses incurred.
Something they should add to this is the life expectancy of like paint or carpet or whatever, because it's always a question as to, you know, how much can I charge them for, you know, new carpet or.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because we're always talking about deducting money from the security deposit. So how much can we deduct? And HUD has some guidelines that they use, and they're probably pretty aggressive, actually. I think for the lifespan for carpet is probably estimated to be 5 years, but that may not be reasonable. So that's a good question. But remember, if somebody moves in and it's painted, new carpet, and after 1 year, everything is no longer usable or serviceable, then you can charge them back for 4/5 of the cost to replace. If the useful life is 5 years in my example, they're entitled to use up 1/5 of the useful life of whatever that may be. So that would be the methodology you would use when charging any tenant back, and that's defensible.
So what happens if the security deposit doesn't cover the full bid?
Then you pursue them civilly. So whether through small claims or through other forms of litigation, you know, and we'll get down to that, but the dilemma is going to be, if you don't look carefully at the lease agreement, and there's 2 ways of looking at it. The lease agreement limits recovery of legal fees and costs to $1,000. That's the default. You can change that. But then if you change that as a landlord, that also gives the tenant the opportunity to pursue you for recovery of legal fees and expenses for more than $1,000. So how you view that as a landlord, that's a good question. What's going to be most beneficial for you? But the default is $1,000. That's nothing when it comes to litigation. Any questions about that? Okay. And then let's see, in section C, 4C, it talks about security deposit will not be returned until all tenants have vacated the premises, and all keys returned. Any security deposit returned by check shall be made payable to all tenants. For me, I'm going to give at least an estimate within 21 days and give them an accounting. I would not go beyond that time frame, no matter what this says. And then the reason I wanted to bring up the deposit in regards to being made payable to all tenants, so often we see multiple tenants on the lease, and they may not be husband and wife, or whatever the case may be. It could be 3 roommates. So the dilemma is, when I return the security deposit, who do I make it payable to? The lease says specifically all individuals on the lease. Now, the other time it becomes an issue, sometimes we see lease substitutions or individuals that are being substituted out. So if you're going to agree to that, you have to address the security deposit itself, because the person who's being released per se and being substituted out may be entitled to a portion of that security deposit. So if we're going to agree to allow them to no longer be a party to the lease, we want them to state that for example, the security deposit remains, and I'm not entitled to any of the security deposit. So we should address that also.
I have a quick question on security deposits. So I know that it's 2-month maximum. Does that include pet deposits in there, or are they separate?
It does. It includes anything that's deemed to be a deposit. So John's saying that the maximum deposit that you can collect from a tenant, if the place is unfurnished, is 2 months. So no matter how you characterize it, pet deposit, whatever the case may be, key deposit, if in our example, the rent is $3,000 a month, you cannot collect more than $6,000 total as the security deposit. Furnished, $9,000. Waterbed, an additional 15 days. So I see, and John, I think that's a good question that you brought up. Often we see people saying, I want a pet deposit, I want a key deposit, I want this, this, and this. And you're falling within the cap. Well, the dilemma is, if you set a pet deposit of $500 and there's more than $500 worth of damage due to the pet, are you entitled maybe to use something else to cover that? I don't know. So I prefer just saying deposit myself, because it's broad in terms of what you can use that money for in any case. You're not categorizing it, so you're not limiting yourself as a landlord in regards to recovery. And then late charge, return checks. So there is nothing statutorily defined in regards to the maximum late charge under section 6A. I've inserted 6%, and that's deemed to be acceptable because if you look at someone who has a mortgage, it's acceptable for the lender to charge a 6% late fee. So it's probably not something you want to put yourself in the position of saying, I'm going to charge you a 20% late fee, because it's probably not defensible. And then you'll end up collecting nothing. Why do that? Yes.
We just missed the electronic payments and stuff. Is Zelle can be part of a, no.
Well, actually, I see what you're talking about under section D. Payment via electronic apps such as PayPal or Venmo, the default is will not be accepted. You can check the box and say it will be. So you can accept that. There's nothing that prevents you but the default lease.
The problem with Zelle, it gets into your account, and a lot of people have limit on Zelle, and they split the payments.
Yeah.
Or if it's 3 different roommates, split payments. You as a landlord, won't you expose yourself to potential problem because you accepted, like Zelle, if you got Zelle, it's in your account, so you accepted partial payment. And what if the other part of Zelle didn't come in? So
I understand what you're saying. So she's suggesting that maybe you only received a partial payment. It doesn't matter in any way whatsoever. So on the first of the month, I received $1,000, the second 1,000, the third 1,000.
Yeah.
Well, how did we devise a lease? If they're more, there's no obligation for a landlord to give a 5-day grace period. First of all, you can say it's due on the first. Anything after that, it's late. So if we just use my example, it's late. So what you can do, you could send the dilemma is going to be, you're going to have to send a notice to pay or quit. And then they may have deposited those monies. So they can cure that within that time frame, within that 3-day time frame. So remember, a lot of these notices now, it's not just 3 days. It doesn't count weekends when you're sending a notice to pay or quit. So if you send it out on Wednesday, you're going to actually have through Monday to deposit the money. But in your example, if you never get all of the money, you theoretically should, if you want to evict them and enforce the notice to pay or quit, return the money. That's always a dilemma with any electronic deposits, tenants, the other time that comes into play. You don't want to, for example, the lease is terminating, you and the tenant haven't come to an agreement in regards to extending the lease agreement because we can't come to terms. Tenant deposits the money into the landlord's account. So the landlord doesn't want to accept the money because if they accept it, they have now created a month-to-month tenancy. To avoid that, you'd have to return the money.
What if the tenant returns it again? It just keeps it going.
I haven't seen that happen. I guess they could continue to do that. You would just monitor your account, be sure you return it. That would be what I would do.
Game of chess right there.
Yeah. But I haven't, anything's possible, right? I'm just going to keep depositing my money so I can create a month-to-month tenancy and the landlord's going to give up. I don't know. Maybe someone can answer that question for me. Can you stop somebody from depositing money in your accounts?
Like
There might-
set your account to not accept.
Yeah, I
it.
wonder if there's a way to do that. Block them?
No,
You can?
I think so.
All right, there's the answer. John said you can block them.
They just changed the limit from, it used to be 30, I used to get 3,600, now they have to split it this month. So they lowered the, someone was moving for a year. And they lowered the amount.
For that individual, or are you just saying as
For
a
that
practice?
individual. Same
Yeah,
person
for that
can pay
individual, yeah.
For a year and they just dropped it.
That's odd.
Richard, can't you, if you don't reach any agreement with the tenants regarding the new fees or something like this, can't you write a notification that if no agreement is reached and no document is signed on extension, the lease is terminated? So to
Well,
avoid.
I don't even,
Huh?
oh, well, I would say that it's probably need to back up, because if it's a lease agreement, the lease agreement terminates. So there's no presumption that the tenant has any right. Let's assume we're exempt from the Tenant Protection Act. So there's no presumption that the tenant has any right to remain on the property. So taking a step back from that, remember, we're supposed to give the tenant an opportunity for a pre-move out inspection no sooner than 2 weeks before lease termination. So as a courtesy, we would notify them the lease is terminating, give them the opportunity to do the pre-move out inspection, because they had the right to cure any deficiencies in the property or to minimize their costs. And then at that point in time, so they should be fully aware.
So you
I would
notify them
think.
30 days prior to
Yeah.
the end of the year?
You can send them a notice that you can just send them a courtesy notice that you're not going to be renewing the lease. I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, Gail, but we
Yes?
should be preemptively addressing this.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
So let's assume we don't do that, and that's probably happens quite often. Well, if they don't reach terms, the landlord should just not accept any money. That's really the only way the landlord can protect themselves to stop any type of a month-to-month tenancy. And the tenant's presumed to be in default if they haven't vacated the property after lease termination. Let's see. And then parking, simple. Parking is permitted as follows. My suggestion would be on the premises, and the right to parking is included possibly. So check those boxes, or if you want to, you can say parking is not permitted on the real property. You can do that also. And then storage. My approach would be to only choose 8B. And now every situation is going to be different. But in 8B, it states, except for tenants' personal property contained entirely within the premises, storage is not permitted on the premises. So I would suggest leaving 8A blank if you have questions, unless you're including separate storage. Then utilities, it's already, the presumption is the tenant's paying for all utilities. And then I would say that the HOA payment, assuming there is one, is not deemed to be a utility. So you can actually have them pay for it, or you can exclude it. And then water sub-meters, gas meters, electric meters, it's just specifying whether there are or are not separate meters and how those things will be billed to a tenant. And then condition of premises. So this is odd the way this is drafted, in my opinion, but actually A, B, and C under section 10 and D can all be checked. You can actually address all of them. Now, in no case does it mention the traditional move-in, move-out form. It talks about form MII, the move-in inspection, and it's similar to the move-in, move-out form, excluding the fact it doesn't have the move-out section to it. But this is stating contractually that we should complete a move-in inspection form and provide that to the tenant. So you can do that at any time before or after the tenancy begins. And then the tenant actually has an opportunity to notify you of any property conditions that are not acceptable. So does everybody use the move-in inspection form or the memo? I'm just curious. It seems like the memo is a better choice to me, but contractually it's not specifying the memo. And you could do that, for example, under section D if you'd like.
Is the memo still available?
It is. It's still available. Yeah. I have it here as a matter of fact. So here's the move-in inspection form, just so we can see it. It looks just like the memo.
No, it's different. The memo had two sections, move in, move out.
Right, I agree. It looks like the memo, but it's missing the move out section. So the move out, if you use the memo, MIMO, it still is drafted in the manner of which you're describing.
So is it still available?
It's there.
It's right there, actually.
You just passed it.
Thank you.
I think the move-in form gives you more options than the move-in, move-out form.
Does it?
It's like the bedrooms are done differently, the bathrooms are done a little differently. I think it's more difficult to actually understand it than the memo.
I see. Here's the original form you're referring to, Julia. Whereas the MII does not have the move out section. So it doesn't seem to be too terribly convenient to me. You only have the move-in condition. And that's it. My concern is contractually, it's specifying MII. So in section D, you can specify move in, move out if you'd like. You could do that. Any other thoughts about that? We're gonna move on here. I'll do that quickly. Not that quick, obviously.
So Jeff has a question. Where does the landlord's agent obligation end on a what? Here it is.
I actually think the new lease states where your obligation ends.
It does. It does. So we'll get, that's a good question now, and I'll get to that. We'll cover that because everybody wants to know, where does the agency relationship terminate? So it was never clear before, but now the lease agreement that we're looking at gives us the ability to state when the agency relationship terminates. So it's very helpful because otherwise everybody thinks you're going to continue working for the next 12 months until you're releasing the property, right? Addressing all the questions from the tenants. It just isn't that way. It just never ends. So we're going to put it in writing. It doesn't, they won't read it, but at least we have something in writing specifying when our job actually ends. And then 11A, what's common, I'd say tenants shall water the garden, and then you can specify under election section 11C, who's going to take care of the landscaping. And then 11G, the following items of personal property are included. So TVs, washers and dryers, refrigerators, but nowhere in the lease does it specify if these, assuming if they haven't been abused, who's responsible to fix them. So if the tenant still wants a washer and dryer functioning, it doesn't, the lease itself does not place that burden on the landlord. whether it's been misused or not misused. You might even specify something to the effect, if it stops working, you need to pay to have it functional. But right now, it's just specifying that the landlord will not maintain or warrant functionality of those items. Yes.
I have a question for you. Regarding to the garden, sometimes they want the tenant take care of the garden. But at this point with the water and with all issues, what about if when you don't, even though you put water in there, the garden is damaged or is in a bad condition when you give it away, so they can take the deposit for that?
Well, yes. However, if we look at section E, it mentions water restrictions, local water restrictions. So if there is a restriction, and that's the claim, that's a good question. I'm not aware of any current watering restrictions at this point in time, but last year it probably was something that was an issue. But if they're not maintaining it, I would say, yes, you could deduct the cost to repair the landscaping or to replace the landscaping if they didn't maintain it properly. I think when designing a lease, I probably would have two things that I would give consideration to. I may have base rent and then charge them separately for the landscaping and just put it in here. So you're assured that the property is maintained properly. I don't think most people do that, but it's a consideration at least. Does that answer your question, Carmenza?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Animals, okay, we all know there's a difference between animals and pets. We can't do anything about somebody that has an animal, assuming they actually have a recommendation to have some type of an animal for anxiety reasons, for example. But if it's a pet, you can make a condition that they cannot occupy the property with a pet. And then keep in mind, when you have a lease agreement and the lease agreement is fully executed, if they then state that they have a medical reason to have an animal, there's nothing you can do about it. You cannot charge them any additional security deposit or increase the rent. And if you refuse to permit it, it's discriminatory and you're going to lose.
Even if they bring it up after you accepted that.
Even if they bring it up after the lease is fully executed, correct. It's discrimination.
That happens.
Yeah, it does. It happens often, as a matter of fact. And then if it's a condo, so on and so forth. Hopefully I didn't pass. Oh, I'm sorry, I did pass this up. Section 15, rules and regulations. The rules and regulations it's referring to are the landlord's rules and regulations. So you can impose rules and regulations on a tenant. Maybe you don't want them putting holes in the wall or nails in the wall. So that is certainly at your discretion. And then condominium plan unit development, obviously, there are rules and regulations, and you would be providing that information to them. We look at section 16C, either after lease execution or possibly before. I think it's probably ideal to give it before. You can specify how many days after lease execution or commencement you have to provide the HOA rules and regulations. And then some of these things are pretty self-explanatory. Alterations or repairs, it says what they can't do. They can't put screws in there. Small nails only, it's mentioning that. And then you're going to specify whether or not the property has been rekeyed. And then it talks about entry also. Why you're entitled to entry. Can you just state that 6 months into the lease agreement, I have the right to come in and inspect the property? Probably not. May violate the rights. Do you do that, Julia? Yeah, Julia's a rebel. That's all right. I can't blame you. I think it's a good idea to go in and inspect the property, right? You have to have a reason. And then if you do put the property on the market for sale, the lease specifies that you can actually give them a notice of sale and entry, and that's under section 19B2, indicating once I give you this written document, I only have to give you 24-hour telephonic notice to access the property to show it, for example. If they don't allow you in, it could be a reason to give them a notice to perform covenant and quit, and then file an unlawful detainer action to get them out. And then photography or photographs on internet advertising, This is here specifically because we see this often with properties that sell. Buyers don't want anything shown on the MLS or anywhere showing the interior of the property. And I would assume tenants probably have the same thoughts. I don't want anything showing on the internet that shows my personal property. So this is telling them, it's putting them on notice that there may be pictures taken and there's nothing that the landlord or housing provider can do. And then assignment and subletting. If somebody does assign or sublet the property without the landlord's consent, it's a violation. As a matter of fact, it may be an incurable violation. So there's nothing they can do possibly if they do sublet the property. So termination of tenancy and an unlawful detainer action is really one of the few things a housing provider can do if somebody improperly sublets the property. Now, you can, as a landlord, you can entertain substituting tenants. So that is certainly acceptable. The lease agreement is very specific. It does not release the original tenant from their lease obligation if the person who's subletting defaults. And then 23, joint and individual obligations. This is probably much more relevant for situations in which there's multiple tenants, students, for example. Each and every tenant is individually or severally responsible for the lease. So the landlord can just pursue one of those individuals if they want. They don't have to recover from all. Possession, I think that's self-explanatory. And then that's not completely self-explanatory. So possession. If the tenant's not in possession of the property, if the landlord is unable to deliver possession within 5 days from the commencement date, theoretically, the tenant could terminate the lease. So there could be issues why. Maybe it's under construction still.
What if there's other way around, you know, all of a sudden, you know, something happens and he has to cancel the lease agreement? Is there any statutory legal things?
So if the property is not ready and then 5 days after the commencement date, the landlord decides they don't want to proceed.
Yeah, let's just say they just signed everything is executed, and then like 2-3 days, let's say, you know, landlord said, I changed my mind.
The lease does not give the landlord the ability to do that. And I would say statutorily, it's not up to the landlord to make that decision.
So basically, they have to just follow through with it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not fair.
It's California.
It's not fair. I tend to agree with you.
It's so one-sided.
It is one-sided. And then Section 25C, right to pre-move out inspection and repairs. Remember, the landlord has an obligation to give the tenants an opportunity to perform a pre-move out inspection no sooner than 14 days prior to lease termination. And it gives the tenant the opportunity to address any deficiencies that they may have caused on the property. Because if you think about it, after the lease terminates, you want a tenant going back in there to correct any deficiencies or damage they created? No, we're never going to give them access to the property. We may never get them out, as a matter of fact, or it's going to take us a long time. So we need to give them that opportunity to do that. So there are notices to send them, and the tenant doesn't have to agree to the inspection or doesn't have to request it. If they don't request it, wonderful. If they do, you have the right to schedule it, typically during normal business hours. Yes?
So when we give 30-day notice, like when we know that they're moving out, we give them that notice to bring out inspection, and they choosing if they're gonna do that or not?
Correct. So let's assume they respond.
Yeah.
We should be scheduling it during normal business hours. And if they make it very difficult to schedule that time, the landlord's just going to state, and they have the right to say, I'm just going forward with it on this date. All right. Does that answer your question? Just want to make sure. Okay. All right. So we want to do that. No question about that. But there are reasons why you may not be obligated to give them the right to perform a pre-move out inspection. Non-payment of rent, for example. Right, so that right is no longer available to them. Subletting, so that's another reason why you don't have to give them an opportunity to do a pre-move out inspection, or if they're a nuisance. I had a case recently in which there were parties going on constantly, and the landlord's getting notifications, the HOA is contacting them, HOA is threatening the homeowner. Well, you can terminate the lease because that's give them a notice to quit, right? So those are reasons why you're not obligated to give them the opportunity for a pre-move out inspection. And then breach of contract, early termination. If they breach the contract and terminate early, then you can recover for them any costs of leasing a property, preparing the property for lease once again. Vacancy also, so you can do that. Or just remember, once they vacate the property, give them the written, within 21 days of vacating the property, and accounting of what's taken place with their deposit. That's your obligation.
So the deposit in that case within 21 days of their vacating? Like, let's say they vacated 1 month early before the lease ends. They're responsible for that month, right?
Yes, I'm going to qualify that in just a minute.
Okay.
So they're responsible for that for the duration of the time that it's vacant.
But the like deposit, not from the day the lease ended, from the day they vacating 21 days?
Yeah, if they don't pay that last month, for example, because if they paid, doesn't matter. But if the assumption is going to be they didn't make the payment for the last month. So the landlord can deduct from the deposit any days that the property is vacant. Remember, the landlord has an obligation to mitigate any damages by making the attempt to release the property again. And then the question that comes up, the landlord sometimes gets so tired of being a landlord, they just decide, I want to sell the property. Then they want to put it on the market. Well, my approach would be, let's just put it on the market. Don't increase the rent so high that no one is ever going to do it. Just make an effort to show it a little bit higher rent, market rate rents, put it on the property if you want to substantiate your reason for trying to recover those days in which the property is vacant. So we witness things like that over and over. Our landlords just give up and say, I just want to put the property in the market, but they still want to recover the lost vacancy time, right? But if they move out a month early, they don't make that last payment, the landlord within 21 days of them vacating should give an estimate of what the total costs are going to be, or estimate how many days the property is going to be vacant. So they can deduct from the deposit the estimated days the property will be vacant and any cost of remediating any deficiencies that the tenant caused. If I estimate it's going to be vacant for 45 days because I've got a lot of work to do, that's exactly the accounting you're going to give them. And most likely the tenant's going to owe you money. So you'll send them that notice and say, you owe me $5,000. Good luck recovering.
Is it even worth it to go after?
Is it? Well, going after them is a different story, right? Can you find them? That's the biggest issue. Once they vacate the property, it's very difficult to find people. So it is helpful to know where they work. And then that's an aspect with rent-free that I don't like. Remember, with rent-free, we don't get the social security number when they're submitting an application. Rent-free does not give us a social. So you may still consider getting the traditional rent screening application completed, asking for their social security number. So you can actually have the threat of impacting their credit. Yes.
In the new application, I think on the page 2 or 3, there is a choice for the tenant to authorize the landlord to see the social security or not.
Oh, for rent-free?
Not for rent-free on the standard CR application.
Yes, yes.
But can I put in a contract? I start, like, after learning that, I start putting in a contract tenant to provide social security upon signing a lease, tenant to provide social security number directly to the property owner.
I don't, you just, I would say that.
Because before we always had the social security, now.
Right. Yeah, the screening application, it asks for the social, and it also asks for authorization to run a credit report. I don't see any reason why that can't be done.
So like right now, that application is clearly, you don't know if you're gonna get social or not.
Right, right. I don't see why you couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing,
After this ordeal, there's a driver license I put on the contract. Tenant to provide upon the lease signing, tenant to provide directly to the landlord, to the
Yes.
property owner. The
Yes.
social.
yeah, and the reason Julia is saying that she instructs them to give your driver's license after acceptance is in this specific case, someone submitted their driver's license with the application. And once they weren't denied, they just weren't the person that was chosen as the tenant. So they claimed discrimination because you saw my picture and you made a decision based upon the color of my skin. So we never asked for a photo ID during the application process. After the lease is signed, or that's part of it, once I've granted credit, now I want your driver's license. Now I want your social security number, right? That's part of the contract.
Richard, I have a question. I'm not sure what you said. I understood what you said with respect to deducting vacancy from the security deposit. If there are damages to the property and it takes you time to fix the property, can you deduct the vacancy time from the security deposit?
I would say absolutely. Absolutely. I think you just need to show a good faith effort that you are trying to mitigate the tenant's damages. That's highly likely that you're not going to be able to lease that property for a period of time because of the damage that the tenant has caused.
Yeah, but then that raises the question, the contractor might not be available for 2 weeks. And then how do you?
You need to make a good faith effort, and you
yeah.
need to be able to document that you've made the effort to address these deficiencies. I think that's just a reasonableness test, actually. But yes,
Okay.
it's gonna take you 60 days because they created that much damage. I would say that it's going to be at their expense.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. And then let's see, insurance. Now, remember, if you don't request insurance contractually, insurance is not required. Under section 29C, you should be asking for insurance. And everybody that's in real estate probably now understands that obtaining homeowners insurance is more difficult than ever. As a matter of fact, for landlords, it's becoming more difficult. And the premium is going to be higher for a landlord that can't show their insurer that they are getting a certificate of insurance from the tenant. So it's going to cost the landlord money, most likely, if you cannot provide or demand that the tenant provide evidence of insurance, naming the landlord as an additional insured or as an additional interest. So check that box.
Hey, Richard,
Yes.
something happened with a previous client of mine. They're month to month right now after several years of been renting the property. They asked for the rental insurance. So at the beginning, they were able to do it for the first 2 years. End up in doing the 2 years, they have a water damage that it was not by the tenant, it was a problem of the property. Then in the third year, they're gonna buy renew the tenant's insurance, and they didn't do it because it was a claim on the property before, not for the tenant, but for the owner. So that was kind of strange that they weren't able to do it again. So how the landlord can say, okay, you have to do it, but they don't sell it to you.
Well, unfortunately, we're all finding fewer options for insurance, whether you're a tenant or a homeowner. There's going to be options. They're just going to be more costly. It's probably unlikely that you can't find a policy. It's just at what cost? That's the dilemma.
Well, they say that it was water insurance claim. So I didn't know what it was though, but.
Right, they don't know what it is, but there's a claim. That's all that matters to any other entity that's considering insuring the property. They're going to see that claims history for up to 5 years.
That's true.
Yeah,
But-
it's just gonna be more expensive.
Isn't the claim go with the person, not the property when they do a search?
You know, that's a good question, and I may not be correct about this, but I think I've witnessed both, actually. Both the property and the person who's filed the claim.
Yeah, I've never heard of anybody having trouble with renter's insurance because renter's insurance is not really insuring the property as much as it's insuring the renter for loss of use of the property.
Well, it's also naming the landlord, because what's probably gonna happen, it depends who causes the damage. If it's the tenant who inflicts the damage on the property, it's likely that the property owner's insurance company is going to manage the claim and probably pay for any remediation, but they're gonna subrogate that claim against the tenant's insurance policy attempting to recover. Because why would they be on the hook for something that the tenant caused? If it's nothing that the tenant caused, I don't think they're gonna have the right to file a claim. It's probably more also associated with the liability claim. If there's an injury on the property, then I think that the tenant's insurance is likely to be in the first position in regards to covering the cost of the claim. Once again, depending upon the circumstances, is the house in disrepair? Was the landlord aware of the disrepair? Did they do anything to correct it? Yes.
I always point out that renter insurance is saving almost as much as a cost in a car insurance to the tenant. So when they say, oh, renter insurance, how much do I have to pay? You're gonna pay and you're gonna save on your car insurance probably as much as you pay. So you're getting the renter insurance pretty much free of charge.
Oh, I see. Huh.
And second point, usually standard part of insurance, homeowner or renter insurance, medical coverage to others, and it's usually $1,000.
Yeah, it's small.
It's very small, and if you increase it, some limited to 5,000, some limited to 10,000, but the increase will cost you probably like $10.
That's it.
It's very small, but it's a huge benefit, and I learned it the hard way. When my mother-in-law fell in our backyard and broke her hip, they had $1,000
Medical coverage.
insurance.
Yeah.
That would have covered her. And if we would have 10,000, we would have saved 10,000 out of
I see.
pocket for us. So I always point out to everybody who I talk about insurance, yes, your bigger
Increase the limits of
medical
liability for that.
for others. And people say, oh, people have medical insurance. No, it's not for you. It's for somebody who
Else.
was injured in your property.
No, that's a good point.
It's
Suddenly the person who was your best friend's coming back to you for money.
Richard, I have another question with respect to the question I asked before about deducting the vacancy from the security deposit. So suppose a tenant does not let you show the property for new potential tenants at the end of the lease. And as a result, there is vacancy. And in the lease agreement, they have to show to let you show the property. Is that also deductible from the security deposit?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I think if I were able to document it, it's easy to do. The fact that you have made effort time and time again to access a property and they refuse it, and it's caused a dramatic delay in regards to leasing that property, I would take the approach of making the deduction from their security deposit. Let them fight it.
Okay,
That would be my approach.
okay, thank you.
I think that's a good question. That happens unfortunately all the time, doesn't it? You know, they won't allow access to the property. And in mediation, if there is a dispute, mediation is mandatory within the contract. So there's a dispute between the parties, actually. It also mentions if the agent is involved in a dispute, the agent could agree to mediate any claims. Attorney's fees, as you can see, the limitation is $1,000 that a prevailing party may collect. Remember, you must agree to mediate if you hope to recover any fees. You can always change that $1,000 to anything you want. And then other disclosures. So remember now we had the rental property owner questionnaire and the rental property owner disclosure. Now that's part of this whole lease packet. So it should help us complete these disclosures more accurately. And then one thing we should do, residential environmental hazards booklet. We always wonder, and this is the same thing in the purchase contract, what is this for? Well, if the landlord, the property owner provides that to the buyer or tenant, this actually insulates the landlord or property owner against any claims associated with environmental hazards. That's the whole reason of providing that booklet. It makes them aware and they can't pursue you if there is a claim associated with that. Yes.
38B,
30B,
38, no, 38,
B. Oh,
always mark it. And even if it's a condo, because if the tenant wants something, I didn't mark it when it was a condo because I read premises is a house. So it's not a house, it's a condo. It doesn't matter, it's a house or it's a condo. You don't want your landlord to be responsible for pest control. I had a litigious tenant who had a condo rented, and that's why I did mark it. And they were asking me for pest control. And actually, condo was providing some pest control, but it was not enough for them. If it would have been marked, it would not.
It wouldn't have been an issue.
Who's paying for it?
Yeah.
So this is the tricky paragraph.
Thank you.
Say tenant is responsible for periodic pest control.
Yeah, but I think the way this is designed, it raises a question. That's the point. Is it clear enough?
Like, at least the landlord is not responsible.
Yeah.
Let them argue later, let them deal with it later, but if it's not marked, the landlord is responsible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just poorly written because it gives you the impression if you don't check it, it still states tenant is responsible for periodic pest control. That it could be interpreted differently.
Yeah, 'cause the tenant can always say, they
Yeah.
must argue this is a condo, not a house.
They could argue that also, right? So you might under other material facts specify that. You could do that also.
In the G part, right?
Well, house
In
is
G.
not a single family residence. A house, it means it's not a hotel, it's not there. So it's like, it's better to mark it, right?
I think so. I do. Yeah, I don't know if house necessarily means a single family detached residence.
It's a house where you live. It's
Yeah.
a house. It's not a.
Yeah, doesn't matter where I'm living. If I'm, I'm going home.
Yeah.
If it's an apartment even, I'm going home.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Julia. That's good. And so in section 38H, additional disclosures, it talks about the rental property owner disclosure and rental property owner questionnaire. Or actually, at least the disclosure in there. And then confirmation of agency, no different than a purchase contract, right? Who's representing who? And we're almost to your question, Jeff. Termination of agency relationship, section 41C. Jeff was wondering, when does the agency relationship end? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? In section 41C subsection 1 says, once housing provider and tenant enter into this agreement, broker will not represent owner in any manner regarding the management of the premises and any representation duties a broker may owe to in any agency relationship that broker may have with either housing provider or tenant is terminated. So it's saying, once the contract is executed, my agency relationship is terminated. And then the term, let's see, under section 41C2, notwithstanding paragraph 41C1, that means not in conflict. It also, we can specify when it's going to terminate. Well, that's a good question. I would suggest the delivery of keys to the tenant. That's what I would mark in this paragraph. Once we turn the keys over, everything is terminated and there's something definitive there. That's how I would approach that section. So thereafter, we have no further agency relationships and no obligation to either party.
What about the completion of the move-in form? Aren't they
When's
sending
that
to-
done?
Yeah, but aren't they gonna send that to you and then you send it to the landlord for signatures?
Well, completion, remember, the contract's going to specify, is it before or after occupancy?
If we say 3 days after.
You don't
In that
want to-
situation.
So why do we want to get into that?
Because that's
3
part
days
of our job.
What was that, John?
Because that's part of our job, doing the move-in form and representation. So I always put the same thing, like Carlos said, completion of the move-in inspection. And as I'm doing that right now, I'm texting the client to say, now I'm at day 3 of the date they moved in. And I said, I need the move-in form sent back to me so that, we're done.
I don't disagree, but I think there's two different aspects. Section C1 talks about the agency relationship. And section C2 talks about our duties and responsibilities. And I think we're trying to differentiate between that. And our duty or responsibility to provide a move-in form does not, what it's trying to separate is the agency relationship versus what we're going to physically do. So I don't have any objection to say, I would just say, I want to be sure, you can say completion.
No,
I understand why. I prefer not to do that. But I think in section C2, it is not referring to the agency relationship. It may say, yes, this is what we're still going to do.
Well, because you could check more than one.
You could check all of them.
they never.
But why?
They'll tie you up to that deal.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't mean that we're not going to do the, yeah, it doesn't mean we're not going to do the move-in inspection form.
So you don't want to be responsible.
Yeah, what if they don't allow you access to the property for some reason?
Yeah, delivery of keys.
I think delivery of keys, it doesn't prevent you from doing the move-in form for your client. But I think delivery of the keys is something that's very definitive, something you actually have control over.
So do you need to worry about being this property manager if you start doing things afterwards?
Well, that's why the contract is finally offering some
That's
type
why-
of definitive area in which we no longer have an agency relationship, because it
But-
just,
If you do, then you're deemed to be a property manager, would you say?
could be, yes, that's why we're saying it ends.
Okay.
That is the benefit of what the change in this contract is. When does it end? We're saying, okay, once we deliver it, we're done. We're not acting in any other capacity representing the seller or the landlord or tenant in this case.
Jeff's got another question.
Does he? Can you check none of them? I guess you could. I don't like the way the paragraph's written myself, but I just like something that's definitive, Jeff. I would prefer to say delivering the keys. That's a definitive act, as a matter of fact. And it could be delivery. If you can't hand it to the tenant, hand it to the tenant's agent. And then section 46, check the key safe lockbox addendum. It gives the landlord the right to place a key safe lockbox on the property, right? If they're going to be releasing the property again. And then theoretically, if a lease or any purchase contract is negotiated in a foreign language, we have an obligation to provide the documentation in that language. That never happens. It's great, huh? And then one thing I wanted to mention, guaranteed. This paragraph, I think, is beneficial. Is that we know that the contract is limiting the recovery of attorney's fees and costs to $1,000. Now, a guarantor doesn't have the same benefit. So if there is a guarantor, this paragraph states that recovery for all costs is available to the landlord in this case against the guarantor. So guarantors' obligations are far greater. And I can assure you, when you contact them and say that the tenant's not paying, they're going to act.
So guarantor is what most people call a cosigner, right? For
Another word for it,
Yeah.
correct? Another word for it, correct. And then let's just look at these quickly. These are just other disclosures. And then this form is just so critical, the rent cap and just cause addendum. Assuming, remember, we shouldn't be making the determination. The property owner should be making the determination, but you're going to help them check the box notice of exemption. If you don't check the box, then it's not clear whether or not you're exempt from the Tenant Protection Act, and you're not going to be able to increase the rent whenever you want. You're going to be limited in regards to the rent increases. So now, once again, as of August 1st, any rent increase for someone who is subject to the Tenant Protection Act is limited to 8.8% over the lowest base rent during the preceding 12 months. And you can only increase rent twice in a 12-month period also, if you're subject to the Tenant Protection Act.
And that twice is not to exceed the 8.8%. It could be 4% at one
Correct.
time and then another 4.8%.
No,
Let's say-
that's not true, because that's cumulative. It's
From
compounded.
the original,
From,
right?
no, but when you increase rent, it's always going to be based upon the last rent increase. So that's compounded. So if it's 8.8%, that's the cap. I increase it 4% today.
Yeah.
Then in 6 months, I increase it 4.8%. 4.8% of the last rent you've been paying. That's typically what people do. So now effectively, that 8.8% is greater because it's now calculated based upon the lowest base rent from the prior 12 months.
So my question in the example was like, if you're entitled to raise a $500,
Uh-huh.
you can do a $250 raise increase now and then 250 later.
You could,
Yeah.
right.
So
It's just if you multiply it by 4.8% for the second rate increase,
Yeah.
then it's because now I went from 1,000 to 1,200. Now I'm going to take a 4.8% rate increase on 1,200. So effectively, it's going to be greater. I'm going to be exceeding the maximum. And the Attorney General just recently did prosecute a company in Northern California and recovered about $400,000 for the tenants, as a matter of fact. So they now are beginning to enforce the Tenant Protection Act. So we want to avoid that if we can. Fair housing disclosures, blah, 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 blah. And we're almost done here. And then part of the lease listing agreement. Let me find it. Disclosure. Well, the rental property owner disclosure, this is going to be something associated with the lease listing agreement, right? So we're going to update the checklist, and this is going to take the place of the ESD, the exempt owner disclosure. Then also with the lease listing agreement, there's a rental property owner questionnaire. So there's questions that we're asking of the property owner in reference to aspects of the property that were never asked before. So we'll use that to complete the lease agreement more accurately.
Is this just for us, for the advertising, because it's not supposed to go to the. Yeah, right?
The rental property owner questionnaire does not go to the tenant. The rental property owner disclosure does go to the tenant. So the lease agreement references the RPOD in the lease itself. The RPOQ is for our benefit.
Okay, so it forms attached to the lease listing
Yes.
and it's so painful right now because the landlords, they're ready to sign the lease, but then they got to pick up on the form and the lease contract finally get signed. So is that as possible? I guess it's not us, it's the CAR. Separated, because I can find the listing and then send them the form separately. Like, I get so many pickups on that form, I cannot get the lease.
Because you're sending it electronically, correct?
Yeah.
So you want to somehow separate the lease listing and then thereafter have the RPOQ signed separately.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, is there a way we can send it out? There is a way, obviously, you.
This way, like PDF and then sign
Yeah.
separately, but then.
It does. So is there a way, Carlos, out of all these forms within the packet, for example, to just send the lease listing agreement and later on send the rental property on the questionnaire separately?
I think the way she said
Is
is
the
like
only
saving
way?
it as a PDF. Yeah, because now it all shows up as one form.
It does.
So the lease
Right.
listing agreement also has that form in it as one whole continuous form.
Right, so is there a way to break that out without having to manually create a PDF?
I can look into it.
But I understand what you're saying. We just want to get the listing agreement signed first of all.
You know, asking them for something else, they're getting irritated and
Yeah.
maybe like listing is not signed, so you don't want to hear it.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, right? Let's just get the listing agreement signed. That's really what our goal is here, right? Here's the questionnaire. So this is the form she's talking about. That's attached to the lease listing agreement. The rental property owner questionnaire. This is attached to the packet for the lease listing agreement when you send it out for signature electronically. So yes, there's a lot of questions that are being asked. And people don't like doing that. I would say when taking a traditional listing for sale. Usually we don't bring the transfer disclosure statement with us or any other disclosures. We just want to get the listing agreement signed. And then thereafter, have the disclosure signed. So it's time consuming.
But in that situation, you would rather take a couple of extra steps to convert it to PDF and send it for signatures than for them to have to.
Exactly, but
Complain
then
about
it
it.
takes me more time, you
But
know.
so, yeah, but in that situation, or you want to take the extra time or make them go through the extra time to fill all that out.
No, I wanted that, I want to sign the listing first
Right.
and then work with
Right.
them on what else I need from them.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
the listing is
Yeah.
signed, they can't get, change their mind or something.
Yes, I understand why you want to break it out. For some reason, the system isn't allowing us to do that to facilitate what you're talking about.
Yes.
You can overcome it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? We have any other questions that I missed? I don't think so. Okay, well, thanks for coming, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you.
So much fun. Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye.